Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. On this month's edition of Other Voices, we're going to talk about something that's not been in the news very much, purposefully so maybe, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the latest massive trade agreement being negotiated behind closed doors by the United States and any number of Asian Rim countries. And we're going to learn a lot about that, what threats are possibly being negotiated behind those doors, threats to our democracy, our health, our environment. We'll find out. Helping us to find out, joining us for the first time on Other Voices is Carleen Pickard, Executive Director of Global Exchange. Carleen, welcome to Other Voices.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Glad to have you here. Just a little bit more about Carleen. She has an MA in Anthropology and Development from Sussex in the United Kingdom and has been doing social justice work for a long time in Chiapas, Vancouver, Ottawa, and San Francisco on a couple of occasions, right?
Times, yeah.
So
happy to be back right now.
Okay, good. Welcome back to the drought.
Yeah,
good timing on that. I think most of our studio audience is probably familiar with Global Exchange, but we are on the internet, so why don't you take a minute to tell us about Global Exchange's work?
Sure.
I've certainly been familiar with them for a long, long time.
Oh,
Wonderful
thank you.
Organization.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's here, who's a member. You know, we are a membership-based organization, so we appreciate everyone's support in all forms. We just passed our 25th anniversary. So
Happy anniversary.
Thank you. It was a good year. And we were founded, by 3 folks from the United States who were traveling in other countries and really saw the devastation that U.S. foreign policy was causing in those countries. So when they were in other places and hearing the stories and seeing and experiencing, what U.S. government and U.S. corporations were doing, they realized that they just really needed to come back to the United States and do public education, specifically about what U.S. policies and what U.S. corporations do abroad, and then what people in the United States can do to change that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of people who've done international solidarity work, and almost to a person, they end up saying, what I learned was I need to go back to the United States and work on those issues there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that. And you actually do cultural exchanges, you do the reality tours. And
yeah, as part of that project to help educate folks in the U.S., we certainly run campaigns, education campaigns in the United States. We bring speakers from other countries to talk about the impacts, that they've experienced. Yeah. But we also run what we call reality tours. So they're about 10-day trips to countries where U.S. foreign policy has had a negative impact. So that's countries like Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, any number of countries, unfortunately, in Latin America. And trips to Iran and trips to North Korea to really help build people-to-people ties so that people can, hear from folks on the ground what's happening, but then also have that real commitment and that human contact so that they come back to the U.S. and are just compelled to take action.
Yeah, first-person accounts are really important, very important. So you'll be seeing, for those of you watching at home and on the internet, you'll be seeing the website come up several times, but just to mention, it's globalexchange.org. Check them out. It's an excellent organization. So one of the things you talk about is these international trade agreements, because I know 20 years ago in the NAFTA struggle, Global Exchange was one of the groups we were working with in trying to stop that from getting passed, which it did. We'll talk about that later. But let's get the big picture, the overall picture. What the heck is TPP, without getting into the details of it? Where is it in the negotiations, and kind of what's the timeline? And
Sure.
Okay.
Go there, yes. Yeah, so again, very unfortunately, it is the next iteration of NAFTA, the next iteration of the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which is a trade agreement that we actually defeated. It's a massive expansion of what the U.S. government's been doing, which is just sort of single country, these bilateral trade treaties over the last couple of years. But it's a massive undertaking to try to put together an agreement that involves 12 other countries, like you were saying, sort of in the sort of Asian and, well, I guess in the Pacific Rim would really be. So it's massive. I think those of us that have done trade work really see it as a NAFTA on steroids, see all of the provisions that we've seen in past trade agreements in this agreement, but accelerated, with a whole new kind of corporate power grab and access for corporations to every part of our society that we value and cherish.
After all, it's been 20 years since NAFTA, and the global economy, corporate power have all evolved, unfortunately, in those 20 years. So that's why I think it's really important that we look at this trade agreement.
Certainly, and I mean, if President Obama had had his way, this would have been signed a long time ago, would have been sort of done and sealed at least last year. Really, I think also to avoid all these conversations that we're having now about the 20th anniversary of NAFTA and just how devastating that free trade agreement has been to all three countries that have been part of it. So I think that the timing is particularly interesting now in that we can be using these NAFTA examples exactly to say why there shouldn't be an even bigger iteration of such an agreement, up to Congress. So it's an interesting time. I think there's a lot of really good work that's been done showing the impacts of NAFTA. And back in the day before this was signed, I mean, we lived in like a pre-free trade world at that time, so we didn't know that those of us that were trying to stop it, we didn't know that was actually going to happen. We didn't know those things were actually going to come true, the offshoring of jobs, the lowering of environmental standards, the deregulation and harmonizing downward of all sorts of regulations, let alone this ridiculous investor state provision that exists around this so-called dispute resolution.
Which we'll get into in a little more detail in a bit.
And we sort of said this is what's going to happen if we sign NAFTA. But at that time, of course, pro-free trade people were like, don't listen to them. They're just blowing things out of proportion. But at this point, I mean, we're 20 years on, and we've got some pretty hard data that NAFTA's pushed more than 1 million Mexican farmers off their land, basically devastated the corn growing agriculture in Mexico and forced those people to leave their land and go work on these horrific maquila jobs along the U.S.-Mexico border. We've seen the offshoring of jobs in the United States. And, in Canada, not to be forgotten, in NAFTA, also just a huge challenge to environmental standards and a huge, devastating extraction of resources in that country.
Of course, one big difference between the NAFTA struggle and what we're going through now is we don't really know what the language is in a lot of this agreement,
Absolutely.
whereas NAFTA, we could read it while the fight was going on. So where is it? Are the negotiations done, or are they still working on it?
Right. So again, certainly had President Obama had his way, it would all be done deal now. But both inside the negotiations, there continue to be rounds of talks every couple of months. So, the country trade negotiators and the over 300 corporations that have access to these negotiations.
That was my next question. Who's behind these closed doors and sitting at the table?
Yeah, are flying around the country. So a latest round just finished in Singapore about a week and a half ago. And what's encouraging from that really is that because they are getting, what they would say kind of close to inking the deal or doing the handshake or whatever, is when the differences are really starting to come out. So, previously the U.S. had been challenging like some of the demands that Vietnam was making. Coming out of this round, it's pretty clear there's some big distance between Japan and the United States on actually getting closure on the deal. So that's real positive, like inside stuff that's happening in those talks, which will hopefully keep drawing it out for a bit longer.
And now we heard about fast track in Congress, and this came down with NAFTA, and in fact with every trade agreement. Just quickly for people, as a little refresher, tell them what fast track is and where are we in Congress with
Yeah, well, this is where things get really exciting, and I'm really optimistic that we can do some really solid work in the next couple of weeks, really. And that, looking at a calendar, I mean, we can be pushing fast track. We can be pushing a vote on fast track out even past the November election. So it's really critical that we pay attention to it right now. It's a special thing that the United States has a piece of legislation that comes and goes, and that it expires and Congress has to pick it up again. But it's a piece of enabling legislation that actually takes the power away from your congressional representatives and they give up the ability when negotiating trade agreements to have really any say on the agreement at all. All they do is vote it up or vote it down.
To take it or leave it. Take all 30,000. Do we know how long it is getting
I have no
to?
idea.
I think NAFTA
I'm
was,
sure it's huge.
was 20,000 pages or something. I remember
Yeah.
meeting with our local congresswoman, and she was saying she hadn't made up her mind yet because she hadn't read the
You're
agreement
never
yet.
going to read it. Yeah.
I know,
Yeah.
I didn't for
Certainly
a minute
not
think she was
before the
going to sit
vote.
down and read
Yeah.
20,000 pages of trade agreement.
Yeah, and so your point around the secrecy is also very important because there's no access to the Trans-Pacific Partnership in any form right now, in any kind of public way. There's a very small way, but it's impossible. The Congress people at the same time are being asked to give up their ability, their choice, or their decision that when they do get access to the text, that they actually have any say over it. They by passing fast track, they choose to not have a say in a fundamentally important agreement that the United States would be entering into.
And the administration wants fast track because if Congress wants to change something, then they've got to go back to 12 other countries and say, we'd like to change this.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's why this is exciting is because there will be no TPP vote if there is no fast track. So fast track, the two things go hand in hand. They are not the same thing by any means, but they will absolutely want fast track in place before they bring the TPP up for a vote.
So fast track is kind of our fast track to stopping it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. By
and
stopping
my
fast
thing
track.
right now is fast tracks in the slow lane.
Yeah.
And so we're doing really well in
And
stopping
I
fast track.
understand Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said he opposes fast track, right?
Yeah.
Does that pretty much kill the idea, or will the administration be back to twist Harry's arm after the elections? Or
Well, it was definitely
what's your
the
guess
first
on the
crack.
timing? Yeah.
Like it was, Harry Reid came out against it, and then just 2.5 weeks later, Pelosi came out and also said that she doesn't support fast track. So, the tides, the tables have entirely turned. If you read the language around, January 9th, when the fast track bill was made public, or when they said, okay, we're going to go forward, and when they put it on the table, there was all sorts of language of like, this is great, we'll get it done right away, everybody supports trade, so they understand
every
the importance
president
of
has
this.
had it, is the line that they always say, because it has to get renewed every time.
Right, yeah, because it expires. And so the fact that it's, dragged on, through February, and now in March, there's either just 11 or 12 days when Congress people are actually in Washington. Like that also looks pretty good that we can keep it off the agenda for those days. And then, it really kicks it into the boring summer period, and then we're into the elections in November. So really people are honestly saying it looks like we could have put fast track off, until after the election. And then, how do you go back to a trade deal and say, oh, a year later, okay, now we're just getting around to actually thinking about it.
Yeah.
So it is exciting, it's interesting, it's important, and people should know where their congresspeople are coming down on fast track. And then importantly, if your congressperson is either for or against fast track, that doesn't automatically guarantee they'll be for or against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They need to be questioned on both those things.
But it's important to press them to oppose fast track.
Absolutely.
Because that's the democratic thing to do.
Yeah.
Small d, Democrat.
And we can do it. You just need to keep making the phone calls. And,
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty details of the agreement. And first of all, we don't know everything that's in it because A, it's still being written, as you mentioned, and B, nothing has been officially released. So how do we know at all what's in it at this point?
Right. Well, I mean, some of it, first of all, if you start with the principle of common sense.
Yeah.
So we've had NAFTA, we've had, a good attempt at the Free Trade Area of the Americas, we've had CAFTA pass, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and then these bilaterals. So what you see in all of those texts is this kind of evolution from NAFTA to just further kind of refining it, refining that text around, to just make it stronger, and unfortunately stronger in the, in the favor of corporations. So that's the first part of kind of how do we know, and why it's fine to stand up to the people who say, well, you don't know, you haven't seen it, you're just inventing that. I mean, there's some pretty logical deductions that you can make. There have been, there have been a few Congresspeople who have kind of made demands that they see the text. And so this was the thing I was talking about just before, about there's one tiny way you can see it, which is Alan Grayson from Florida. I mean, he went to the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, made an appointment to go in and read the text that they, put on the table, I guess, and let him look at it. And then when he left, told him that he couldn't actually talk about what he'd read because it was a state secret. So we've had one congressperson that's been able to actually see the text that isn't now allowed to talk about it with the rest of the people. So again, the TPP, huge on secrecy at this point. But then we sort of, I think the third important kind of piece of like, what do we know in it, is that there have been 2 leaked chapters, and that's thanks to WikiLeaks. So back in November, this intellectual property right or internet freedoms kind of chapter was released, and then the second one that was just back in February was the environment chapter. And so those 2 chapters, there's been up there. You can go to the WikiLeaks site and you can read it. There's like all of the alarming stuff that we've been talking about and that we've been concerned about.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Is any of it public in any of these 12 other countries that are participating on this?
No.
They're all keeping it secret.
Yeah.
Democracy, you gotta love it, don't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, the other side would say we have a lot of advice. We have a lot of negotiators coming to the table who are experts in, whatever field it is or whatever chapter they're part of negotiating. And like I said, there's 300 corporations that have signed up that have access, to participate in the negotiations. So, I don't see a whole lot of us there. I don't see a whole lot of public participation. But, the pushback would be that, oh, no, there's plenty of consultation, don't worry.
So I take it there's 300 corporations, but groups like Greenpeace or Sierra Club or Electronic Frontier Foundation aren't in there.
Yeah, no, there's no stuff in there. Yeah.
I'm shocked.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, at least, let's start with the chapters that have been leaked, that we really do know chapter and verse on. And the first one that WikiLeaks put out was the internet, what was it called? The internet, something.
Yeah, it's the intellectual property rights chapter. Yeah.
So what do we learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, that deals with, patents, deals with the regulation of copyright on the internet. And for, those of us that believe in internet freedom, you see in that chapter just a huge clampdown on the ability to share information, on the ability for, things that go out on the internet, not, to be harsher penalties for kind of copyright infringement, and then stricter definitions of what copyright is. Folks that you were mentioning, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I mean, they're the best go-to organization that really, has dissected that chapter kind of piece by piece and can really pull apart, what we have to be worried about and concerned about.
Yeah, they were on this program last month.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
cool.
But we weren't talking about TPP. We were talking about our own little problem with freedom from surveillance and stuff. So this is all to the benefit of
the corporations. I mean, you also see,
internet big tech giants, or
like publishing houses and folks at Hollywood, and those kind of things. The things that claim and want to have like stricter control over copyright.
Yeah. Having just received a letter not too long ago from Getty Images about our own website.
Yeah.
This concerns me a little bit.
Yeah,
it came with a rather hefty price tag that they wanted.
Yeah, they don't like that. I mean, similarly, you see those kind of same rights, or that would, seeing those in that chapter makes us then feel, even more clear that the chapters that deal with medicines and that deal with patents on medicines, that the things that we had worried about in terms of stricter control over patents, like more control, less ability for generic drugs to be available for people, more control of pricing on medicines, that, that what we see in the IP chapter then kind of bleeds over into the other areas where we've been concerned there'd be increasing corporate control.
Yeah, well, intellectual property covers a very broad range of things, and probably the internet is one of the least of them.
Right.
I think medicines is one of the patents on medicines, and denying critically needed medicines to people who can't even come close to affording the going price.
Right. Yeah,
So,
certainly not in this country.
Slow down and go through a little more detail what we expect, say, on medicines as a result of tightening up on intellectual property.
Yeah, I mean, what you've seen in, what we've seen sort of with other bilaterals and then, the larger WTO, World Trade Organization, language around intellectual property rights and patents on medicines is, the things that we all see and experience in our life daily, which is this increasing monopolization of where you can go to get the things you need. And therefore they, those places that you go kind of by de facto price control. So around medicines, there's been some really important cases around access to AIDS medicine in South Africa, and fortunately some victories that have denied the medicine companies the ability to hold just a patent and not allow generics to be made for people who can't afford the patented or the brand name like drugs. So it's it's concerning in that medical corporations are huge and have
and so
control
TPP
over.
would even tighten up even more on the availability of generic drugs.
Yeah, and I think the important thing too is to remember in the United States, but you've also got all the other countries that hypothetically would be signatory to this. So whereas I wouldn't for a second say that there's any kind of equality around healthcare in the United States,
right.
But you certainly go to Malaysia or you go to Vietnam, to other countries that are with a much larger population, struggling just to survive. To take generics, the access to generics away from those people is certainly I would consider a pretty serious human rights violation.
Yeah, a thing to keep in mind as we talk about this, these are threats not only to people here in this country, but to millions and millions in other countries who can ill afford any more abuse. The other WikiLeaks chapter.
So it's an environment chapter. It's very.
I bet that's really
interesting. It's very exciting. Again, it's the way that they're released is also really interesting. And I'd encourage people to just go look them up because we all, for whatever you think about track changes, in documents, you can actually see what countries have added what kind of comments or we would prefer this language, and it kind of says what country it's coming from. So you definitely get
it is
a good
working
sense
document.
of what's going on.
I've looked at it online, and I would encourage other people to do it. It's revelatory.
Yeah, and you can, and it's been helpful also to get a sense of where the other countries are, vis-a-vis the United States. So, even though, again, I would just say these are comments on a document, but you can kind of see the U.S. is pushing for this, pushing for this, pushing for this, and even some pushback from other countries being we wouldn't agree with this, or we think this goes too far. So coming out of the round, I'm trying to remember where it was around last August of negotiations, there was sort of this sense that the other countries were coming away feeling the U.S. is just being bullying, just incredible pressure from the United States. So to kind of see it come out in the documents is also very, it's not surprising, but, it does give you some light on particularly, how the other countries are just both, in some ways unable to fight back. The U.S. has a huge entourage of people that go to do these negotiations, and some of the smaller countries can only send one envoy, or they can only go for a couple of days.
Yeah.
But to get a real sense of there is internal struggle going on.
Why do these smaller countries even enter into this process
That's a good question.
To get rolled by the powerful United States? They must see some benefit down the road, or are they just intimidated out of staying away?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because we sort of, it's 20 years into NAFTA, we know how terrible this has been for Mexico. Why can't some other countries, take some heed from that? But if you look at the countries that are, kind of are in this circle, you wouldn't want to be left out. There's too much riding, and you see the United States as this huge, it's saying it's a huge, massive trading partner, and you want to kind of get close to this. You just don't want to be left out.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem.
It is a globalized economy. Well, on this environmental safeguard stuff, we know from NAFTA and some of the other trade agreements, bilateral and the attempt at FTAA, that some of the provisions allow corporations to challenge, for example, some local environmental safeguards as impediments to trade. I have to figure that's writ large in TPP.
Without a doubt. I mean, referring to what we call investor dispute resolution. In NAFTA, it's Chapter 11, so it sometimes gets referred to as Chapter 11, not bankruptcy, but this particular chapter in NAFTA.
But it probably is a bankrupt idea, right?
Right, certainly bankrupts anybody who tries it. But so I mean, exactly what you said. So by entering into this agreement, all parties agree that corporations have the right to sue a foreign government if they're trying to do business in that country and there's some sort of barrier, perceived or not, but barrier to them to be able to do business. And they're actually allowed to sue for future profits. So, the best example, and I think, there are a number of these cases that so there's two things important, but I'll give you a good example of one of them. But the things that are also important about them, because they do sound so ludicrous, you can't believe this is actually happening. So, I mean, important to know that there are a number of these cases that kind of float around. And what happens is they kind of just go into the ether for a little bit. They go into this really complicated process of it is like a secret tribunal behind closed doors where, in the example I'll show you, the foreign government, even if it's a local municipality, actually doesn't get to represent itself at that tribunal either. So you have this bizarre body that kind of meets and hands down their decision. 9 times out of 10 for the disputes that actually have reached some sort of conclusion, they've gone to the corporations. So people don't win in these tribunals. We know that. The second thing that's also super important about them is that sure, there's all these cases, but what is harder to track is the chill effect that a threat of one of these lawsuits has.
Keeps the law from being enacted in the first place.
So in your community, in your state, you could be working really hard to pass some sort of regulation or pass, some new ordinance. And, it would really only take, somebody coming in and just putting the pressure on you, tightening the screws or whatever,
just
to just
picking up
say,
the phone and
look,
say you're going to get sued.
yeah,
and
this
you
is
can't
subject
afford
to
it.
investor state. Yeah. So the current example that we talk about and that we talk about with, vis-a-vis the environmental safeguards, environmental standards, there's currently a case that was just launched about 3 months ago by a energy company in Delaware called Lone Pine. And they do lots of energy extraction, but one of the things they do is fracking. So north of the border in the province of Quebec passed a moratorium on fracking because, people of Quebec were like, we don't really know if this is a good thing or not. We want more time to investigate it, and we want to see, what the impacts are. But Lone Pine was very keen to go into Quebec and do fracking. So Lone Pine launched a suit saying, well, the fact that you passed this law, or you people got organized and decided you would do this, that's actually taking away future profits to the tune of $230 million. So we're going to sue you for $230 million. So the next thing that happens in this situation is that this is the province of Quebec that did this. So if it was your municipality, if it was the state of California, this happens to be the province of Quebec. The province of Quebec doesn't actually defend itself in this case. It's the government of Canada that has to defend itself at this tribunal that happens. So you have the government of Canada who signed up to NAFTA, who believes in free trade, who is supposed to be the one that defends this action that the province of Quebec took against a $230 million lawsuit. It's just incredible. So, bringing that back home, because I know, in California we talk about the increase in fracking in California,
Yeah.
and there's really good reasons, the drought, amongst other things, to be concerned about fracking. But the city of Los Angeles just passed a moratorium on fracking
Right.
this last week, I
Yeah.
guess. So, it's also interesting, I think, some energy company in Canada could just be getting itself ready, to go, well, we were going to frack in LA. So then they're going to go and ask the U.S. trade representative to represent itself. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and I'm still having trouble getting beyond time-traveling profits.
Right, yeah, future profits, definitely. No, it's good. Yeah, so they're big, the cases are big and important to kind of look out for. They make your head spin and can't believe the corporate greed and the entitlement that these corporations have to run roughshod over decisions that people make.
Yeah, and that in the end is what this is all about. It's not improving the quality of life for individuals in these 12, 13 countries. It's improving the quality of and quantity of profits for these transnational corporations.
Yeah.
Why don't we see what our in-studio audience might have to say or ask or share opinions about. If you have a question or a comment, I just ask you to raise your hand and wait till our studio microphone gets to you, so people watching at home. And okay, right over here. And speak right into the mic.
This similar in a way to a treaty with a foreign government that has to be ratified by the Senate, and related to that, can the Senate stop this from going through?
Thank you. Good question. Is it just the Senate that
It's
will
just the
vote?
Senate, yeah. When we get to the TPP, yeah, but fast track is in both.
Why is that? Oh, because it doesn't apply to just TPP. It applies
okay.
to any sort of thing, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. So that's your question. It's an international treaty, so it's only the Senate. And if the Senate votes no, no TPP, right?
Yeah, you've got, yes. Totally. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a good world. That's a good world. I would like to be in that world.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
But I would stress the best strategy that we have now is to delay, if not stop, fast track altogether. It has happened before. While in the sort of TPP world over here, those negotiations are continuing, and we're happy that they're continuing. With some internal division, but the best strategy that we have is to prevent it from ever coming to a vote.
And you said earlier that if the administration doesn't get fast track, they would be unlikely to even bring it for a vote?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
For the reason of cracking it open again would just be a huge headache.
Yeah, somebody might sit down and read all 20,000 pages and take
Point
pause.
out some things.
Yeah, I saw a hand down here in front. Wait for the microphone. And if you are able, I'd ask you to stand up and just make it easier on our camera folks.
Okay. Just a worry.
It's on.
Okay. A worry.
It doesn't echo as much because of feedback stuff.
Okay,
So
thank you. A worry, first of all. 300 corporations must just have untold millions of dollars that they're willing to essentially buy senators with. So that's a worry. But my question is, what is our strategy? I know that, I had been led to believe that Anna Eshu, who is our representative here, has come out against the fast track for TPP.
Right.
She hasn't said whether she'll vote for it. But so that seems pretty safe. What can those of us who live in Anna's district but are worried about other and come to think about it, she's a representative. She's not a senator. So I don't know how much good that really does. But what can we do to stop it? What can an individual citizen or group do to stop it?
For sure, yeah.
her bringing up Anna Eshu, let me just add to the question, because the House did vote on NAFTA. I remember that. I remember meeting after meeting with Anna Eshu.
Yeah.
And I don't want to brag, but we had quite a good campaign going down here, to the point where she called me at home the night before the vote. and said she had finally made up her mind, and I'm afraid I was a little rude and said, no, I think you already made up your mind a long time ago.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah, I've heard. I've heard that she. I'm trying to think. I think I've heard, because I know that we haven't been focusing on her kind of as a fast track target. I've heard on free trade though it's like not super clear. So I think still important to just talk to her about free trade. I think that kind of sentiment is going to be important as we go. Well, hopefully, again, I really hope that we don't ever have to face this where we're talking about who's going to vote which way on the TPP. Like I hope that we just get fast track, go on. Your worry about corporations, the corporations having access and the corporate participation. There's just really encouraging headlines right now in lots of the kind of business trade and the U.S. trade news and stuff. I'm really trying to remember this one that I was reading last night, but it was very much like Democrats try to figure out how to like sell free trade as a good thing. Like it's sort of at the point where the tables are really turning so much that there is this kind of second look going at it, and the fast track stuff with Reid and with Pelosi have just been really, really great as well. So I mean, I've been in this situation before where you can't, or there's like no hope for your representative, so you're like, oh, I don't know if it makes any sense to put my effort that way, and you definitely feel like a little bit handcuffed, right? Because you're like, oh, I want to do something, but mine's either like good or bad or not a swing, and you're, why don't I live in a swing district? So I mean, part of it is there will be a time when there'll be just a ton of phone banking like that will happen. So being able to participate in those things which go much more national. And then it's like just kind of a thing of like really letting people who don't live in your district know and getting them to do something about it at this point. But, we had a January 31st Day of Action, and it was like this tri-national Day of Action where folks in Mexico and Canada and the U.S. were all doing events around free trade and, no new NAFTAs and no TPP. And I think no matter what district you're in, you can still talk to 9 out of 10 people on the street and they won't know what you're talking about. So it's still just super important to do that part out. And I think those kinds of public demonstrations are really important. I think, there's lots of ways that you can do good educational stuff. We designed our rally in San Francisco specifically to be something where we could talk to people as we were going. So it wasn't just like we didn't want it to just be like a whole horde of people like marching down the street. We were like, no, we want to like tell people as we go like what's happening and get them to take action.
Yeah, it's the kind of issue that doesn't loan itself to bumper stickers or banners. It really takes some explanations. One of the reasons we're doing this program tonight is to go into it. But just to clarify, I do recall that Anna made I think she even put the statement on her website that she does oppose fast track. Yeah. She does have a mixed history of supporting trade agreements. Because you have to keep in mind, in this district, she has, a couple sets of constituents: the people in this room, and then the people down the street at Google and Facebook and Yahoo and. I mean,
no, for sure.
She's got some of the most powerful corporations in the country right here in her district, and I've got to think they want a lot of what's in this trade agreement.
Yeah, I think they'd be happy with the IP chapter.
So, Crystal in the back row there.
Hello.
So,
hold it up close.
Oh, okay, great, thanks. So in my work, I've been working hard to make sure that our representatives and other representatives in other districts don't pass the fast track by making phone calls, by not only signing petition, that type of thing. Right now, I think because Baucus ended up going to China, they don't have a Democratic sponsor in the Senate. But Wyden from Oregon is taking it up again. And I think fast track is very important to them because it's not just the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's the European equivalent. It's I think it's the WTO agreement. There is an agreement. There's a World Trade Agreement. And there's a couple others that we found out from a congressperson in New York through her letter that she had sent out and why fast track was so important to pass.
Yeah, for sure.
So I thought that was interesting information. So they may try a different angle on fast track. maybe Wyden with his the Oregon representative might come up with a different fast track. So we have to continue to put pressure on our senators and congressional representatives to stay the course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good comments.
no, it's
What do we know about where Boxer and Feinstein are on fast track and on trade in general and on TPP in particular? Do we know?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like they're pretty big free traders.
Yeah,
So
I
we've,
think you're probably right.
yeah. we've
Did they
sort
make
of
any statements
not-
about fast track in particular?
No.
They managed to duck it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah. I think there was, you know, we put together over the summertime. You know, there was a lot of work done to get together a letter of Democrats, you know, and some Republicans who would be happy to kind of go on the record. No, happy to go on the record to support this letter, to say that they'd say no to fast track. We did a lot of mobilizing to try to, you know, hustle representatives to sign that letter, and I'm looking for the number, but you know, it's a huge number. It's like 153 Democrats,
signed the letter?
151 Democrats that signed the letter.
Huh.
So,
Signed the letter against fast track.
yeah, saying that, and it was in the summer, so
In
it was
Senate
saying,
and House?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
it's saying that if it did come out as it did on January 9th, then they would be, you know, you kind of were guaranteed that they weren't going to do anything. Yeah.
But Boxer and Feinstein would not sign it.
They're not on that list.
That's your fault, I guess.
Yeah, we did
You
Pelosi.
failed.
Come on, we did Pelosi. That was impressive. You know,
151 signatures on anything in Congress
Right, not
is
getting an
an
agreement.
excellent
Yeah.
track record.
But it was a little bit fun. I mean, we had the January 31st day of action in front of Pelosi's office, and then we did march down to Feinstein's office, but in Pelosi's office, and then it was less than 2 weeks later she came out against fast track. So
All right.
we felt pretty good about that.
Yeah.
She also got something crazy like 10,000 phone calls to her office, but it was, I'm sure it was our rally. No, it's all things. It's very
It was
important.
worth signing the letter just to get her phone back, right? And sometimes that works.
Yeah, totally.
I've gotten calls from congressional offices. Can you ask your people to stop calling?
Oh,
No,
yeah,
that's
they
why you're
definitely-
there.
Yeah.
Keep answering the phone. Okay,
Yeah.
we got another question down here.
Yeah. So, the thing about the founding documents of this country is you can read them and understand them. And, like I went to a city council meeting in Sacramento one time and I got the meeting packet and it was like this thick, and probably it only would have been this thick if they hadn't have put several copies of several things in it, And you just kind of have this feeling like the bureaucracies are drowning people in paper, And wouldn't it be a good thing if, like, they agreed on a one-page document so everybody knew what they were signing?
I hope that an agreement between all those countries is longer than one page. But yes, no, I think there's a lot of. This is why they would argue that they need, it is why they would argue that they need to kind of keep it in house, so to speak, or that, the secrecy factor is like, because we already have a lot of people consulting on it, we can't have any more. It's just going to get too messy. So.
How do you know there's 300 corporations? Do they
Yeah,
release lists of who's there?
So
or?
I say 300. There are definitely people who will phone your show or whatever and say, no, there's 500. Like, I've seen a list of 300, which was at some point one of these leaked documents of the attendee list, and the folks at the Citizens Trade Campaign have it up on their website, so you can go and download this little Excel document. It has the names of people, and I'm sure that's not great for all the people whose names that are there. But I know that list is 300. I can imagine it's probably bigger. I've heard people say that, oh no, I read it was 500, so.
It might be.
It seems a lot to me.
It might be 300 on some subject,
Yeah.
and a couple others are invited.
Yeah. Yeah, and they certainly have these things in between the larger meetings, or these sort of larger rounds of discussions. They have these things called intersessionals. And, while there hasn't been one of the larger meetings in San Francisco back in the summer, sort of last minute, we found out that there was this intersessional that was happening in San Francisco. So again, in that kind of like behind closed doors way, we made some phone calls to the hotels to try to figure out, is there, what is this meeting going to be called? Or, we tried to figure it out and, spent some time trying to locate like where this was happening. Right. And couldn't, but then what we actually ended up doing, and again, I think this was a really great idea just to get out and talk to people about the TPP, was we decided that we would make like these big wanted signs. And so we were like, wanted the TPP negotiators, and then kind of carried those signs around town and I think we went to six hotels downtown, like just asking, like, have you seen the TPP negotiators? We're trying to find them. They're missing. And it was just great. And people, I don't know, what, and they want to help you because they're like, oh no, someone's missing. And so then you got to talk to them about the TPP. So it was a lot of fun. It was good.
Of the 300 corporations, some of them have to be overseas corporations, right? Or is that, what's the list you saw?
The list that I saw was like primarily U.S. for sure. Yeah, or the multinationals that exist in lots of the other countries as well as in the U.S. But yeah.
And I'm sure that we wouldn't be surprised by the names on the list.
No, you can name them all. They're in that mall over there.
Okay.
One of the things I was going to say, I think, if there's a little bit more time,
sure.
That on this kind of like, how do you talk to people too about the Trans-Pacific Partnership? I think. We try to be really diligent about reminding ourselves and then reminding folks it's actually not about trade. So it's really tempting to be like, oh, it's a free trade agreement, blah, blah, blah. And then you get sort of locked in this discussion with somebody about whether or not free trade is good or whether or not, that fair trade is actually viable, and these sort of lists of back and forth. I mean, I usually start by saying, it's important to know what the TPP isn't, and it's not about trade, and it's not about democracy, and it's not about workers, and it's not about the environment. And then people say, well, what is that then? You say, it is about secrecy. It's about corporate control. It's about higher profits. It's about lowering standards. And it's about giving access to corporations for resource extraction.
Sounds like a good summary, yes.
It's, because otherwise it's hard when, we've always had this when we talk about free trade agreements. Well, isn't trade a good thing? And of course we agree in principle. Yeah. If you have something and I have something and we agree that we want to trade it, like, that's great. But, again, why lots of parts, the countries in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are so widely different in income and economy that, as opposed to the European Union, where at least you had countries that had somewhat of a level playing field.
They were in a much smaller
and a much smaller geographical area too.
Yeah.
This is massive, and it's dealing with, incredibly poor countries, and the U.S., where I don't really know where the U.S. sits right now, but you have such a huge spread between the economy that's not an equal trade.
Do we know of, and I'll come back to the audience in just a sec, do we know of anything in there, or can probably extrapolate, that would drive even more offshoring of jobs in this? That comes to mind because when you talk about income differentials, that's one of the things. It's chasing the cheap labor, and that's been one of the things that these other trade agreements have really opened the door to, is allowing U.S. corporations to go chasing the cheapest labor costs around the country. Was there anything in any of the leaked documents or the extrapolations that you make that?
Yeah, I think that the experience that we had under NAFTA. So you immediately, right? Like, it's like just like the ink was barely dry. Yeah. That you saw all these corporations flood the Mexican side of the Mexican-U.S. border with maquilas.
Just
and
stepping across the border, not far.
A step across the border, as much up to the fence as they could, right?
You keep shipping costs.
And then, and I think that's like a really interesting part of that period of time back in 1994, when a lot of the argument was that, Mexico was so geographically close that you could just go across the border, you could pay these incredibly horrible wages, and you could, treat your workers terribly. But that's all good. Treat the environment terribly. But, it's all good because you're allowed to do that under NAFTA, and then you just get to bring these goods back into the U.S. for, all of us to buy. And the argument at that time was that, Mexico was so close. Like 10 years after NAFTA was passed, it's probably about right. I was down on the Mexico border and completely shocked to see that there were like maquilas that were boarded up and closed. And it just didn't make any sense, or I just couldn't understand it because, for so long you'd heard of these, like the television factory and all these things that were right across the border. And I just hadn't been paying attention or something. But, these boarded up maquilas, and I was like, what's happening? Like, the U.S. economy is, like, people are still buying televisions.
Right.
And the folks in Tijuana were like, oh, it's just all gone to China. So, that point when it became economically viable for these corporations to actually be shipping stuff across the seas versus, putting them on trucks or whatever to go across the border. So,
that's how much they're saving in labor costs.
Absolutely.
It's a real indicator.
Yeah, and how, we just don't seem to care about fossil fuels at all in this country, and we'll put televisions on boats from China so we can buy them for $100. But, to your question of, like, would we be concerned about the TPP countries, like, offshoring jobs or, I would say continuing this trend of terrible labor conditions. I mean, you've got Malaysia, Peru, Vietnam, Chile, Brunei, like, not countries that are, totally known for their high wages and high standard of living and, excellent treatment of workers. So the extrapolation is, certainly the more corporations can get jobs out of the U.S. and into cheaper countries, the more we'll keep losing jobs in this country.
Yeah. Time for another audience question.
Going back a few minutes ago to your conversation about where these corporations originate. One of the many arguments that the promoters of the trade are making is that this is good for the American good for the American economy because it's good for American companies. But these corporations are so large and doing business all over the globe that they are not, even though they're registered in the United States, they don't really belong to the United States. They have their own loyalty, and it isn't to America. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we need to tell people that, among other things.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, a good example of that is, rather local company, Apple has all this money parked overseas that they're not paying taxes on, they're not investing here in this country, and they're not bringing it back. And when they brought some back, they brought back their own stock.
Mm-hmm. There's no, corporations are only required to make money for their shareholders. That does not equal doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's the theory. And that's the law.
That's the law, yeah.
So we've got just a few minutes left. Is there anything else we need to know about the fight back? Does Global Exchange have anything in particular scheduled that we should know of? Any more international days of action? How did that go, by the way? How international was it?
Canada, there were actions in Canada, and the U.S. and Mexico, which also at that time coincided with a fairly significant forum that happened in Mexico City, which brought people from all three countries together to talk about the 20th anniversary of NAFTA. So it was sort of timed around like that declaration. It's a good document, which if you need a starting point for talking about NAFTA's woes and what the 20th anniversary really means for the three countries, there's a good declaration that exists from this forum in Mexico City. So,
And what about cross-border organizing, especially with the Asian countries, around TPP in particular? What's the level of awareness, organized opposition in some of these other countries?
Yeah, so, if we in the United States ever hosted one of these negotiating meetings, it would be really interesting because they sort of haven't to date. They've been, in Singapore, they've been in Brunei, they've been in Peru, and it's been great, like really, really heartening, like seeing the organizing that happens in those countries. And, there's been some people like the EFF were down in Peru, like to really, lend solidarity and support. But, big street marches that happen to, just show that there is resistance to these negotiations that happen.
So the major negotiating sessions, they do announce them and people.
They're relatively quickly nowadays, and I think they're not I think they're not. They don't have like a set schedule, because I do believe that every time they have one, they like hope it's going to be the last one.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, Singapore just concluded, like I said, about a week and a half ago. I don't know when the next one is, but you have to like snoop
how long
around.
are the sessions usually?
About a week.
About a week.
Yeah, yeah.
It's got to be hard to let 300 corporation representatives get a word in edgewise, in just a week.
Or I think it's great for the airline companies to just fly around the world to go do this.
Keep hotel rooms, vacancy rates down.
Yeah, totally.
Except for the folks from Vietnam who are probably staying in the Motel 6 or something.
So I mean, what we're doing, what we're doing at Global Exchange is certainly, holding the kind of space in San Francisco to, do what we need to do. There are, some targets. Barra, who's just outside of Sacramento, is sort of the most likely Northern California target at this point, both around, definitely around like his position on trade. So, again, like that, not kind of organizing so much in San Francisco proper, but wanting folks to, turn some eyes towards that eastern part of Sacramento. And we'll bring together some speakers and do a forum in about a month and a half. It's also important for people, again, trade fights can go on for a really long time, but these dates are really important. Since January, Obama's had this trip planned to Asia at the beginning of April. He's been very, hoping that he's going to get to go to Asia and be like, it's all signed and everything's great. It's looking pretty unlikely that that's going to be the case. But knowing that there'll be this whole drumbeat towards Obama going to Asia to really get some movement on the TPP. So that's why we have to keep focusing on fast track.
Yeah. So there's about a minute and a half left. And is there any way that people can plug in directly with Global Exchange? Because as I was looking around for a guest for this program, for this topic, it seems like you are the folks that are really out there in this local area taking the lead on that.
Yeah.
And so I want to direct whatever energy comes out of this program into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're definitely on from the straight up kind of public education stuff, very happy to keep doing talks like this, or, bring in other people who represent different perspectives to help put together more educational forums. Looking, not right now because of where we are with Fast Track, but certainly looking to do some delegations to representatives' offices when they're back in the back in their home areas, which is a lot in the next couple of months. So that's really great.
Okay, so people can get signed up at your website?
Absolutely, yeah. There's good info there.
Well, we'll let it go there. Check out the website, globalexchange.org. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. My guest has been Carleen Pickard, Executive Director of Global Exchange, and I thank you very much. A lot of really good information.
Good, thank you.
We're here live on the first Tuesday of every month. Next month will be Israel-Palestine. They're wrapping up some negotiations there too.
Great.
Thanks again for joining
Thank
us.
you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you at home for watching.